Hello, welcome to what's the second event in the BROKEX seminar series this fall at the University of Oslo. Thank you all for coming, and especially to those of you who came very early in the morning from the west coast of the US and Canada, and to the panelists and moderators who are sharing their work with us today. So my name is Heidi Østbø-Haugen. I'm the principal investigator of the research group BROKEX. BROKEX is the short name for the project Brokering China's Extraversion, which is supported by the Research Council of Norway and the European Research Council. And they're also supporting the seminar series. The seminar series runs every first Wednesday of the month, and all the seminars are about how Chinese and global actors interact in some way and the role of brokerage in China's development processes. Today, we'll talk about the inequalities that China's contemporary development has created. And if you want to hear it again, or if you have friends who might want to hear it, we'll put out a YouTube recording later. The scholars who are here with us today to shed light on this topic are Professor Reza Hasmath and Professor Manfred Elfstrom. And they'll both speak based on their recently published books. My colleague, Dr. Jingyu will introduce the panelists and chair the session. So welcome, and over to you, Jingyu.
Thank you, Heidi. Thank you for everyone for coming. The connection from my side is unstable a bit, so please let me know if you can't hear me clearly. So it's my pleasure to chair this session. I'm Jingyu Mao. Just finished a PhD from the University of Edinburgh, and I will soon be a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Bielefeld. And my research focuses on work, migration, intimacy, and ethnicity in China. So I'm focusing on ethnic minority rural migrants in China, which is very relevant to today's speaker's presentation. So our first speaker, we're glad to have Professor Reza Hasmath. He is a full professor in political science at the University of Alberta. He has previously held faculty positions in management, sociology, and political science at the universities of Toronto, Melbourne, and Oxford. And he has worked for think tanks, consultancies, development agencies, and NGOs in USA, Canada, UK, Australia, and China. He was formally trained in philosophy, public policy, international studies, and diplomacy, and social and political sciences, as well as various East Asian and European languages. His award-winning research look at mainly five disciplines. The first one is most closely related to his presentation today, which is the life course experiences and public management of ethnic minorities in global context. And secondly, he also look at state-society relationships and also the evolving behavior of policy actors and citizens in authoritarian regimes, and also the global sustainability and ESG principles and practices. And finally, the essentialist qualities of the self, community, and the state. So a very warm welcome, Professor Reza Hasmath. And the book he's going to present today is this one, is Ethnicity and Inequality in China. It is edited by him and together with Professor Bjørn Gustafsson and Professor Sai Ding. And it is based on the first comprehensive national data set, which is called the China to capture the socioeconomic profile of ethnic minorities, which is called the China Household Ethnicity Survey. And it explores a range of topics relating to ethnic minorities' participation in urban labor market and how they are disproportionately impacted by poverty and their migration pattern, etc. So I'm sure he will provide more details later in his presentation. And our second speaker today is Professor Manfred Elfstrom. He is an assistant professor in the development of economics, philosophy, and political science at the University of Bristol, British Columbia. And he used to be a postdoctoral scholar and teaching fellow at different universities. And he's interested in China, social movements, labor, and authoritarianism. His recent books, which is what he's going to present today, is this one, is Workers and Changing China, Resistance, Repression and Responsiveness. It not only look at the courses, but also look at the consequences of workers' protests and what does it mean for the authoritarian regime, and what does it tell us about the worker-state relations and local policy-making processes and the dilemmas of individual officials and activists. So I'm sure we're all very looking forward to the presentations today. So without further ado, let's welcome our first speaker, Professor Reza Hasmath. So when you're ready, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Jingyu, and thank you to the BROKEX project for organizing these seminars. It looks like a great list of seminars you've organized, notably to Civ and for doing a great work in organizing this. I am going to share my screen with you, so just bear with me while I click on that. Okay, so as Jingyu mentioned, I'm going to present a book that we did with Bjorn Gustafsson and Ding Sai, looking at ethnicity and inequality in China. Now, it is near impossible to present and do justice in a few minutes, and I have the breadth and scope of the book's themes, which talks about happiness of ethnic minorities, which looks at the socioeconomic experiences both in urban and rural sort of contexts, looking at migrants, looking at various kinds of ethnic realities for China's 55 ethnic minority groups and the Han Chinese, of course. So I'm going to focus, at least for this presentation, on the Xinjiang case. And I'm going to use a lot of the data that we were able to collect using the CHESS data to try and articulate that a lot of the issues that we see in Xinjiang, and I'll talk about this in the presentation a bit more in greater depth. While there's a lot of reasons why there's some tensions or concerns in the Xinjiang context, I would submit to you that a majority of it can be rooted to a socioeconomic or economic inequality argument. And I can use the data that we've collected to articulate that argument. So that's going to be the bulk of what I'm going to talk about, at least for this presentation. But I do invite you during Q&As to ask things more about the CHESS data, which is, as was mentioned, is perhaps one of the most unique kind of data sets, because it is a data set that's purely dedicated towards looking at China's ethnic minorities. It was done in cooperation with CAS and the National Bureau of Statistics. Okay, so I'm going to assume you know very little about China's ethnic minorities, and so I'm going to give a very, very, very quick overview. China is one of the most diverse nations. It has 55 official ethnic groups, comprising of a population of nearly 117 million ethnic minorities. And so ethnic minority management is actually operated by a combination of government decrees, social policy protections, there's constitutional protections, there's a national minorities policy. Effectively, all of these policies, whether they're constitutionally protected, whether at the central level or the local level, attempt to promote ethnic minority culture via festivals, via food, via sport, via dance in the mainstream. In the environment we're in, it might be surprising to some that when I do work with officials working on ethnic regions, it is the development of ethnic sort of areas is a matter of great concern and importance for these officials, and it's been so over the last 2 decades plus I've worked with them. At least I can speak with my own experiences. Nevertheless, it is sometimes conducted in the background of tense ethnic relations. And this is notably in the sort of bordering regions such as Xinjiang or Tibet, where in some papers I've written, I look at them as outsider. I disagree between outsider ethnic minorities and insider ethnic minorities, whereby the majority of China's ethnic minorities, the majority of the 55 ethnic minority groups are generally well entrenched and very well integrated within the Chinese construct. And so in the past few years, there's been a rise of flash ethnic violence in the relatively developed areas of China, such as Beijing and Shanghai, as well as to the far-reaching regions of Xinjiang and Tibet. And this is using both government statistics looking at incidences of potential ethnic violence or flash ethnic violence, as well as media reports as well. And so this is the key bit here. I mean, if you look at the prevailing wisdom to explain these ethnic tensions, there's generally two things that people articulate. First is ethnocultural repression, such as state policies that limit religious practices. For example, state employees are not permitted to wear religious attire. And authorities as well. The second reason is that authorities have slowly phased out the use of ethnic minority languages as a mode of instruction, really trying to keep Mandarin Chinese as a dominant working language. There's, I mean, another sort of secondary reason why there's these tensions is that there's a negative commodification representation of ethnic minorities. Now, all these arguments are well entrenched in the literature, and all these arguments, you see it's quite prevalent when we do talk about the reasons why there's ethnic tensions. And in fact, these practices in some can potentially lead to a process of deculturalization, depriving ethnic minority youths, grounding in traditional ethnocultural values. And it can also result in the fact that ethnic minorities may not have as much meaningful exposure to their own group practices at a young age, which encourages ethnic minorities to sinify in many respects, or to, and put differently, to follow the dominant Han Chinese sort of practices. So effectively, the overall effects of state policies and the practices of ethnic minorities, coupled with a numerical increase in presence of Han Chinese in once ethnic minority dominated areas, has led to older ethnic minorities worrying that their offspring will be drawn away from the traditional ethnocultural practices. Now, it's worthwhile understanding the state's responses to unrest in Xinjiang. It's usually, what I argue, is a oscillating hard and soft policies approach. So the soft policy approach, when it comes to ethnic unrest in Xinjiang over the last 2 decades, the soft approach is more the state's trying to increase funding towards ethnocultural sort of practices and activities. In the Xinjiang case, it might be funding more to build and upkeep mosque. The states provide preferential policies in education, which consists of bursaries, scholarships, reduced exam scores for university admission. The hard policy is more securitization. It's more having surveillance. It's about having a social management system, which has made the headlines over the last couple of years. It's about dividing Xinjiang into zones, and then a group of party members are assigned to each zone. And so the hard policy, this hard regulatory approach, is illustrated by the state's attempt to re-educate and reform religious leaders, or those who the state deems as having the potential to radicalize, or the potential to go against the state's sort of approach, or in using the state language, threaten social stability. And so, in this sort of unnerving interaction between Uyghurs and Han Chinese, there's this sort of growing rise of ethnocultural consciousness, which really revolves around highlighting differences to Han Chinese. And so, when you have this growing heightened ethnocultural consciousness among Uyghurs, if it's not adequately managed, it can lead to dissent and social unrest. So effectively, this is a long-winded way of saying that repression is one of the main culprits. But what I would argue, as I mentioned beforehand, is that I would actually suggest to you socioeconomic factors rooted in the labor market experiences perhaps play a stronger role in explaining Uyghur unrest and why we're seeing these ethnic tensions increasing over the last few years. And let me put it to you in a different way here. We can see this in few different forms. We can see this in terms of labor migration and settlement patterns. What we see is that Xinjiang's Han Chinese have a tendency to settle in the wealthier urban areas, while Uyghurs tend to constitute the majority in rural areas or the poorer urban areas. So the stronger Han Chinese presence in cities encourages claims that a form of internal Han Chinese colonization is occurring. And if you look at the statistics, they indicate between 1991 and 2011, the Han Chinese presence in Xinjiang's urban areas have increased at a positive rate of 1.78%. And the corresponding rate for Uyghurs was negative 0.07%. From another standpoint, the birth rate among Han Chinese in Xinjiang is quite low in comparison to Uyghurs, suggesting that the Han urban population is principally the result of increased internal migration. When we look at the division of labor, this is where it becomes really interesting. The division of labor in Xinjiang is greatly shaped by migration to urbanization patterns. In particular, what the data shows is that the oasis settlements in Xinjiang is where the majority of Uyghurs reside, where land is scarce and the small plots cultivated is insufficient to satisfy subsistence needs. Uyghurs have a very strong concentration in primary industries, which pays less, whereas Han Chinese dominate the secondary and tertiary industries. So put differently, the key strategic resources of the region, such as electricity, gas, and water, are managed by Han Chinese. Han Chinese have also moved into the private sector, where minorities are not faring well, as the formal state and collective sector diminishes in economic importance. Now, you can start seeing this in terms of the data here, where this is just a simple descriptive statistics. I did not even, we did do some sophisticated regressions and statistical analysis, but the descriptive statistics, I mean, make my point for me very vividly. Effectively, sociologists might articulate there's classifications such as high status, high paying occupations, and there's low status, low paying occupations. So in this simple chart, that's what I ended up doing for the NBS data that we collected. We look at the occupational sector that are high wage and high status, and the occupational sectors that are low wage and low status. And to be very frank, the descriptive statistics, as I said, does the work for me. Insofar, the Han Chinese groups in Xinjiang dominate all the high status, high paying occupations, whereby if you look at the low status, low paying occupations, they're dominated by the Uyghurs. This effectively tells us that there's disproportionate labor market access for Uyghurs. Both Han Chinese and Uyghurs are relying on group networks, particularly strong ties for information on job openings. And such networks embed labor market behavior to the degree that it produces sectorial ethnic group divisions. In other words, it's a proportionate access to the labor market creates and reinforces these spatial divisions. Now, let me put it to you in another way. So when I first started doing work on this, I ended up, this was again 2 decades ago, I started doing qualitative interviews. I was speaking to young Uyghurs about, what their dreams, their desires, what their goals are, and so I had unbridled access to elementary and elementary schools and secondary schools, to universities, and it was kind of following their life course experiences over the last 2 decades. And when I first started interviewing young minorities, or young Uyghurs in particular in Xinjiang, what was really interesting is that they believed that if they got a good education, if they went to university, if they got a good degree, a good schooling, that they'll do well in the labor market, that they would get a good job, that they'd be able to get the material sort of goods that they desire and coveted. What ended up occurring is that when they graduated in their early 20s, they realized they were not getting very good jobs or any jobs at all. What they realized is that their wages were much lower. But even more interestingly, what they realized is that their wages, compared to their Han Chinese colleagues who had similar education, similar experiences, was much lower. In other words, Han Chinese were earning more than they were. Now, this is a reality, to be fair, that occurs in most jurisdictions globally. It's not necessarily the case in Xinjiang or in China. It's a reality that can occur globally. That is, the expectation of education leading to a good occupational outcome is not necessarily met. Returns to education can be disjointed insofar that to get a good job requires networks, requires the ability to fit within a working culture, or at least perceive fit within the working culture. It requires many other skill attributes beyond one's formal education. Now, the point of fact here is that when Han Chinese dominate the high-paying, high-status sectors, Uyghurs don't have the requisite networks to actually gain access into those high-status, high-paying jobs. So those young Uyghurs who I've been interviewing for the last 3 decades, when they got to the labor market, they had lower returns on their education, as economists would say. In other words, their wages were much lower than what their education might be fit, and their wages were much lower than what Han Chinese were getting on a relative basis in comparison to their experiences, skills, and so forth. And now this becomes cyclical, right? So if for every $1 Han Chinese earns, a Uyghur earns 75 cents, this becomes a function of geography as well. And so the person who earns $1 is going to live in a very different geography than a person who earns 75 cents. And so it's not surprising that if you go to Urumqi, for example, there's Han Chinese Urumqi and there's Uyghur Urumqi, whereby there's spatial geographical variations between where they live. So Uyghurs and Han Chinese, although they reside in relatively close ethnic communities, they seldom meaningfully interact with each other. because of distance, perhaps, of their geographies, but also there is no place for them to have this sort of meaningful interactions. And so this can, again, be skewed towards this idea of the socioeconomic explanation. It is a function of their wages where the geography is. It's a function of their disproportionate wages, while there's different experiences in the labor market. So it is a long-winded way of saying this does not bode well for the economic, social, and political integration in the short and long term. And it would only intensify real or perceived differences between Han Chinese and Uyghurs, thus reinforcing ethnocultural tensions. So in the coming years, what we can suggest is that, and in fact, my dissertation work 15 years ago, a decade and a bit ago, was actually looking at modeling whether or not socioeconomic variances can actually lead to ethnic violence. And lo and behold, what the models I ran suggested that there is going to be increasing flash ethnic violence or ethnic tensions in Xinjiang context because of socioeconomic variances. So we can suggest, even using the data from this book and using from the chess data, is that flash ethnic violence is a manifestation and expression of acute ethnocultural consciousness stemming from Uyghurs' current economic reality, which is disproportionate access to the labor market and lower wages. Now, the irony in all of this is that economic incentives continue to be one of the main tools Chinese authorities use to manage the Uyghur population. And this is evident by the key aspects stressed in the Central Work Forum on Xinjiang a couple of years ago. The underlying idea behind authorities' strong belief is a strategy that Uyghurs primarily want a comfortable economic life for themselves. And what's interesting, if you look at Uyghurs' wages now compared to a decade or two ago, it is much higher than ever before, relative to themselves. But Uyghurs are not comparing their own economic experiences to themselves. They're comparing their experiences to Han Chinese as a yardstick. And that's why you're seeing this sort of discontent developing in many respects. So what I submit to you is that until inequalities between Han Chinese and Uyghurs have been corrected in the labor market, you're going to start seeing this ethnocultural consciousness becoming more so acute, that the Uyghur-Han Chinese conflict will continue to play a significant role in the history of Xinjiang. And I think one of the ending sort of equations I sort of did not really mention is when you do find Uyghurs are not earning as much, there's a sort of a psychological break. Because you remember these interview narratives I was talking about, whereby the young Uyghur wanted to have a good job and wanted to have a good sort of education to attain that good job. And when they got older in their 20s and some now in their early 30s, they found they were not able to do that. In many respects, they said, well, the reason why I can do well is because of my ethnicity. Many became born again Uyghurs, so to speak. In other words, they learn more about their ethnicity. They learn more about Islam, which it has a link to their ethnicity. And so in many respects, their ethnocultural consciousness was highly acute. So what I suggest to you, what would happen in the near future is that in the short term anyways, ethnic tensions will be suppressed, as it has been in the past, using hard policies and regulations. Eventually, soft policies will be reemployed. But ultimately, both the soft and hard policy regulations practiced at present does very, very little to address ethnocultural tensions amongst Uyghurs. It is largely a socioeconomic sort of experience. Now, in my final slide here, I might have a minute or two just to say a few words on this. It is trying to talk about how can actors meaningfully engage with China over this. Now, it's interesting, if you look at the Canadian context, the American context, the European or Scandinavian context, there's a lot of experiences dealing with integrating minority groups. And there's a lot that we can learn from each other and share with each other. And so when global actors use a rights-based approach to engage with China over its treatment of ethnic minorities, this is important. I must stress it is important that you use a rights-based approach, but it is going to fall on deaf ears for the most part domestically in China. So really, it is worthwhile approaching China, not only with a rights-based approach, but also using your own experiences and lessons learned from integrating ethnic minorities. Because as I said, when you look at the lack of returns to education, it is commonplace not only in Xinjiang or China or in Canada, but it's a global phenomenon. And so there's many global themes that can be utilized. So just to plug the book a little, it is a really unique book insofar that it compares and looks at the 55 ethnic minority groups It's looking at ethnic minorities' experiences in terms of linguistic capital, migration patterns, pro-rural policies, subjective happiness. We were really lucky to be able to ask questions about subjective well-being, economic discrimination. The China Household Ethnicity Survey is the basis for what we do a lot of our data. And if you're interested in more additional readings on what I've talked about, but also things that spurned from the book as well, here are some additional readings there. So thank you for virtually allowing me to say a few words, and I am going to stop my sharing.
Thank you very much, Professor Hasmath, for this wonderful presentation. So we'll hear our second speaker first, then we'll open the floor and allow the audiences to ask questions. So at the meantime, if you have any questions for any speakers, you could put it to the chat box to direct message to me. And if you want to stay anonymous, you could say that in your question. Okay, so let's welcome our next speaker, Professor Elfstrom, if you are ready.
Yes, good morning, or rather good afternoon, everyone. Let me share my screen, and I should warn people that PowerPoint has been crashing on me a little bit recently. Hopefully that won't happen with us today. So Professor Hasmath's volume does a really extraordinary job of rigorously documenting a particularly significant form of inequality in China today, namely that between different ethnic groups. In contrast, my book concerns one consequence of Chinese inequality, namely labor unrest and its impact on governance. I begin the book with a pair of anecdotes. The first one dates to April 2004. At that time, after enduring physical and verbal abuse, poor food, a pay cut, and then a pay delay, thousands of workers went on strike and protested at two shoe factories, Xin'an and Xinshong, both owned by the Taiwanese firm Stella International. The incident quickly escalated. Workers smashed production equipment and flipped vehicles belonging to management. It ended up taking public security, aided by 30 factory guards, 3 hours to restore order. Afterward, the police detained dozens of workers and charged 10 of them with intentional destruction of property. But things didn't end there. Labor groups based outside mainland China placed pressure on the multinationals sourcing from Stella, urging leniency. Moreover, the renowned human rights lawyer Gao Zhisheng agreed to take the accused workers' case and gave a stirring speech in their defense. The outcome, although the workers were initially convicted, they were acquitted on appeal. So fast forward a decade. In 2015, angry that Stella had not made legally required payments into a housing fund, 1,000 employees at Xin'an once more took the streets and were joined by hundreds of their comrades at Xinshong. The Chinese state seemed much better prepared than before now. Photos of the 2015 protests showed hundreds of riot police lined up in neat formation, as you can see here. Workers were effectively kettled within the factory grounds, and K9 units were deployed. Lawyer Gao, who gave that dramatic defense back in 2004, had long since disappeared into prison, then been released, then disappeared again. Foreign groups had less political room to advocate for the strikers, and multinational social compacts had been scaled back. Labor's options had seemingly been significantly reduced since the last showdown. However, authorities had also become more willing to meet workers halfway. Doubtless under pressure from the government to do its part to maintain social stability, Stella quickly conceded to employee demands, paying the workers their housing subsidy in cash. And a year later, when Xin'an factory shut down entirely, management went above and beyond what was required by law and generously compensated employees, avoiding another standoff. Thus, from another perspective, labor was in a much better situation and better position than before. So what, I ask, a change in the years between these two incidents? The short answer is that workers from all over China, especially in the country's southeast, where Xinjiang and Xinjiang were located, began taking to the streets. Although official Chinese strike statistics are not available, unofficial counts, including those of China Labor Bulletin, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and my own China strikes dataset, show a dramatic upward trajectory in workplace conflicts. Several of these conflicts have captured headlines. The most famous one is this work stoppage shown in the slide at a Honda auto parts plant in Guangdong in 2010 that shut down the company's entire Chinese supply chain and sparked similar actions at other Honda, Hyundai, and Toyota plants. Another is this taxi strike in Chongqing in 2008 that spread to over a dozen cities across the country. This picture shows a violent protest that blocked the privatization of a steel mill in Jilin province in 2009 and inspired an equally successful anti-privatization effort at a mill in Henan. Here's a strike by almost 40,000 Guangdong shoe factory workers in 2014, probably the biggest single industrial action since the 1949 revolution. This is a mobilization many of you may have heard of by workers at an electronics factory that drew the support of Marxist student groups. And finally, here you can see images from a truckers' strike that occurred nationwide in 2018. The result of all this contention, I argue, is that Chinese governance has been profoundly altered, but in a contradictory manner. In the book, I sketch out a bottom-up process by which this change has taken place, a process that stretches from shop floors all the way to the halls of power. First, you have various combinations of economic sectors and worker demographics that I dub recipes for resistance. These generate different forms of resistance. These different forms of resistance then bump up against state officials' bureaucratic incentives. The government, as all of you know, is intensely concerned about stability. And the government's concern is transmitted level by level down to local officials in the form of various bureaucratic incentives to demonstrate to their superiors that they're on top of things when conflict rises. Demonstrating competence, in turn, yields distinct regional models of control, different models for different forms of resistance. These models add up, on average, to increase state repressive capacity on the one hand and state responsive capacity on the other. This strengthening may be complementary at first. Repression puts an outer bound on how far the resistance, responsiveness, opportunity spiral can run. Responsiveness might take some of the sting out of repression. But the dual dynamic becomes contradictory over time, as repression undermines the trust built by responsiveness, and responsiveness encourages the very activism repression is meant to deter. More broadly, investment in these two forms of capacity inevitably comes at the expense of other forms of capacity building. The process hurts the alliance with business people that the Communist Party has cultivated since the early reform era, and it's just extremely difficult to expertly balance carrots and sticks forever. In the end, you have a lurching, warped form of political development. Let's take this process one step at a time, beginning with the different recipes for resistance. Certain factors tend to coincide with high worker militancy. You can see here, for example, how strikes tend to cluster in counties with higher migrant worker populations, the darker shaded counties in the slide. I show that in places like this, and in sectors like light industry, construction, and transportation, there's more of what I call transgressive, and borrowing from Kevin O'Brien, boundary spanning resistance. In contrast, in places with higher tech, higher value-added industries, and more local workers, you see more contained resistance. Next, these different forms of resistance meet the bureaucratic incentives felt by local cadres to demonstrate to their superiors that they're on top of things. Interviews I've conducted show that extraordinary pressure that unrest places on individual grassroots officials. So for instance, a government researcher in Nanjing had this to say to me: officials are judged as much or more on stability as they are on economic development. Doesn't matter how much you grow the economy, if you have a lot of big incidents, that cancels out your economic achievements. Meanwhile, a labor bureau official in Tianjin said, why do officials care? Every year, the city will review their reports. The officials from different places will just have to sit there and not be able to say anything while the city notes where he or she has done badly. This puts a lot of pressure on people, and it should be noted here, the reports in question are reports about local conflicts of different sorts. Such pressure isn't just some free-floating anxiety, it comes with real career consequences. Here you can see that membership turnover on the Politics and Law Committee responsible for stability maintenance in Shenzhen, a leading city in the tumultuous Pearl River Delta, has been higher than turnover in the Politics and Law Committee of Suzhou in the relatively calm Yangtze River Delta. Given this sort of constant churn, bureaucrats in contentious places have strong incentives to demonstrate to their superiors that they're on top of things again. As you can see in this pair of graphs, as labor unrest has grown in the Pearl River Delta compared to the Yangtze River Delta on the left here, the public security sections of almanacs in the Pearl River Delta, these are volumes that are given as gifts to visiting delegations from Beijing and elsewhere, have shown more attention to workplace issues as measured by their mentions of a number of key labor terms. You can see that on the right here, presumably in a bid to reassure higher levels of the state. The result then is, again, different regional models of control, specifically risk-taking versus orthodox models of control. And I'll explain a little more about that. Based on interviews, I demonstrate how in the moderate unrest Yangtze River Delta, where unrest generally takes the form of contained or at most boundary spanning resistance, the approach pursued by authorities can be characterized as preemption, caution, and nudging. While in the high unrest Pearl River Delta, where unrest takes the form of boundary spanning to outright transgressive activism, it can be characterized as reaction, experimentation, and crackdowns. More specifically, Jiangsu officials carefully monitor workplaces, nipping burgeoning disputes in the bud, but only pass the most incremental labor laws that simply tweak national policies while allowing their branches of the state-controlled trade union federation to focus on old state socialist era welfare functions. Businesses are prodded into line with things like a harmonious enterprises initiative, and local NGOs are given government office space and quietly steered away from sensitive issues. In contrast, in Guangdong, a region with high unrest that takes a boundary spanning to outright transgressive form again, officials don't try to head off each and every conflict. There are just too many of them to do so. Instead, in recent years, they've passed pioneering labor laws that come close to recognizing a right to strike, and have contemplated, but not passed, laws that would insert workers into core corporate decisions. Especially since 2010, the region has supported direct elections for the heads of enterprise-level unions, something long mandated by law, but rarely implemented and conducted exercises that come close to approximating real collective bargaining. At the same time, though, it's come down increasingly hard and coercively on labor organizers and ordinary striking workers in especially high-profile showdowns. Some quotes from my interviews should give you a better sense of what I'm talking about here. So in the orthodox Yangtze River Delta, a labor official had this to say about the local legislative process. Our work style is to first look, second move slow, and third only later put something through. Whereas in contrast, in the risk-taking Pearl River Delta, China Labor Bulletin had this to say about a draft Guangdong law on democratic management of enterprises. Once this local level legislation has been passed, we think it could trigger a major overhaul of the collective consultation system that's prevailed in China over the last 2 decades. Another set of contrasts. In the orthodox Yangtze River Delta, an NGO leader said, "Work for my organization is slowly getting better. People didn't fully understand organizations like this at first. Now the government is supportive." So this is sort of a co-opting approach to these groups. In contrast, in the risk-taking Pearl River Delta, an NGO leader said, "I was just forced to move my home again. I can't find my office, so they make me move my home. In fact, I don't really have much of an office anymore." These distinct regional models of control then add up with a long-term result of more repressive and responsive capacity. To measure repressive capacity, I use provincial level figures on spending on the paramilitary People's Armed Police, a force that's focused on containing large-scale public disturbances, not everyday crime fighting. Here you can see that such spending has risen, whether by the central government or at a regional level. And to measure responsive capacity, admittedly a tougher concept to quantify, I use the outcomes of formally adjudicated employment disputes, measured again at the provincial level. More outcomes entirely or even just partially in favor of workers show a greater capacity to buck the will of powerful employers and respond to grassroots pressures. Here are the total number of formally adjudicated employment disputes decided in a pro-worker split and pro-business manner nationally. As you can see, all types of decisions are rising. After all, the total number of disputes is rising, but pro-worker and split decisions are rising the fastest. To more precisely document the relationship between resistance and these forms of increased repressive and responsive capacity, I estimate 4 cross-sectional time series models that take the form shown at the top of this slide, with a change in strikes as my principal independent variable, and change in either People's Armed Police spending or change in the number of employment disputes decided in favor of workers, split, or in favor of businesses as the dependent variables. I use a change in these variables because a Fisher type unit root test found evidence of non-stationarity in the series, meaning that there are secular increases in the series that lead us to see a relationship between them, or might lead us to see a relationship between them where there in fact was none. I can discuss my controls in the Q&A if you like. As you can see, changes in strikes are positively and significantly correlated with changes in both People's Armed Police spending as well as pro-worker and split decisions. Specifically, an increase of 1 strike in my data set is correlated with 96 more cases decided in workers' favor and 67 more decided in a split manner. Meanwhile, there's no significant relationship with pro-business decisions. To account for the possibility that strike reporting varies across provinces, I include provincial fixed effects and get the same results. Meanwhile, to check whether there might be reverse causality at work, I use an Ariano bond estimator, which includes a lag dependent variable and instruments on past values of the independent variable. And it finds some evidence of feedback for pro-worker and split decisions. In other words, these decisions in turn seem to encourage more strikes. But a stronger and negative relationship with pro-business decisions, while the relationship with police spending stays the same. And last, I dropped some especially influential observations, mainly from Guangdong, and this doesn't change the outcome. And so my results are robust to a number of different model specifications. Increased resistance, on average, means more repressive and responsive capacity. So what about elite politics? I finally addressed this remaining issue in my book toward the end. Might not leaders in charge at the provincial or national level shape both the level of unrest in a place and the state's reactions to it? Using a brief analysis of Chongqing, I show that even in this dynamic city under 2 successive reformist leaders, the liberal Wang Yang and the left populist Bo Xilai, little happened in terms of labor policy because there's only moderate unrest there. But when Wang Yang was transferred to the tumultuous Guangdong, he initiated a number of changes to workplace governance. Thus, politicians may be more or less inclined to shake things up, but whether they direct their energies to tinkering with industrial relations in particular, rather than other issue areas, depends on worker pressure. At a national level, things have definitely changed under Xi Jinping. There's more of an emphasis on using the state's repressive capacity than its responsive capacity to manage labor. But the change is not as dramatic, I'd submit, as it's sometimes portrayed. There were waves of repression before him, and there have been some minor reforms to labor policy under him as well. Now, what are some of the broader implications of the book? First, contradicting both the transitology and resilience paradigms in research on authoritarianism, which both treat the state as relatively fixed. I show that day-to-day change in autocratic rule is real and worth studying. Social movements, furthermore, can have an impact outside of democracy. And you can observe broad shifts in governments, not just individual wins and losses. Autocracies maybe are best understood as nesting regimes within regimes, models of control within models of control. Protest obviously builds the state, but also profoundly warps it. And maybe most basically, the book cautions against an overly linear understanding of political change. And it should give readers both optimism and pessimism regarding the fate of China's workers and of workers struggling in similarly difficult contexts. I'll leave things there, and I look forward very much to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Professor Elfstrom. Maybe I could start asking of you some questions. And again, I welcome questions from the audience. Please do send your questions to me, either stating your name, institution, if you like, or stay anonymously if you prefer. So first, let me start some question for Professor Hasmath. I think this book is really very informative, and it is based on the first ever data set for the ethnic minorities in China. So in the book, you also discuss briefly why, my question is why there's so limited data for ethnic minorities in China, and why there's so little large scale quantitative research on them.
So thank you for your question. That's actually a really good and apt question to ask. Well, foremost, it's not that there's limited data. There's actually a lot of data. The question is, why is there limited public use data? And the reality is it's a super sensitive topic. And so that plays a role. Second, I think what you're going to find is that the majority of ethnic groups, they are well integrated for the most part, but there are groups in the bordering areas, which I mentioned, the outsider minorities like the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, the majority of the 10 Muslim ethnic minority groups are not doing very well. So the data does point to that. So I think it's contentious insofar it shows that there's an unfinished project of ethnic minority development, and the data would reinforce that in some parts of China. But it is, again, there's a lot of robust data out there. It's just in private use. And in fact, for the chess data that we have, I'll give you an example into the insight of what happens with a data such as this. We actually had to aggregate it. So we had it disaggregated by all 56 groups rather, so 55 ethnic minority groups plus Han. But in order for us to have it public use, we actually aggregate most of the data into an ethnic minority variable versus Han Chinese. And that way, the picture looks much more rosy full, rather than saying some groups are not doing very well. But there's also some groups doing super well. So the Koreans are doing extremely well, even better than the Han Chinese. So that's the reality there. That's why I think you see very little public use data.
Yeah, thank you. So another question for me is that exactly as you mentioned, your book highlighted considerable heterogeneity within these ethnic minorities. So you also mentioned maybe should we be more cautious with when we use a umbrella term ethnic minorities?
Oh, definitely. We need to be cautious. And again, this is not only in the Chinese construct. Because I do a lot of work globally, I see this very similar reality. So if you use the word Asian American, for example, that is a massive construct that has many different ethnic groups there. Similarly, for ethnic minorities in China, how do you classify almost 120 million ethnic minorities as one cohort? You really can't do that. And in fact, the majority of ethnic minorities have very different experiences. Now, there's also another thing to consider is that legally, there's protections to ethnic minority groups as a category. And so it doesn't disaggregate by the different 55 ethnic minority groups. And to be very frank, if you're looking at social policy protections and returns to education, and addressing lower returns to education, it really only applies to a very few ethnic minority groups. And so if you have a one-size-fits-all sort of approach towards ethnic minorities as you do in China, you're not targeting the most neediest ethnic minority groups. So as a category, it is analytically problematic. On the flip side, however, once you try to change that in the legal sort of apparatus within the social policy protections, and you identify some groups, not other groups, that opens a major can that it is extremely complicated from a governance standpoint. So I can see both sides why we have this category, but analytically, it is problematic.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. So I also have some questions for Professor Elfstrom. So I really enjoyed reading this book. And as you mentioned, when I read it, I feel optimistic and pessimistic at the same time. And I was wondering, in the book, you socialist states. So I was wondering, could you share more about that? What's your research has an implication for other similar post-socialist states?
Yeah, I approach China as a post-state socialist authoritarian regime. I know people throw all kinds of labels on China. That just is my chosen one, but I think it's a good label because at least when it comes to labor relations, China shares certain challenges with other governments like those of Russia or Belarus, or Egypt, for instance, that have some sort of socialist heritage. Namely, it has what all authoritarian governments have, a sort of inability to deal with conflicts at arm's length via courts or elections or whatever. Every conflict is just sort of absorbed right into the body of the state, plus these sort of special legacies of their past state socialism, namely that economic and political power are fused really closely together in a really sort of obvious way. Obviously, this is true in Canada or the US or lots of different contexts, but it's really obvious and sort of up front in the Chinese context. They have hollow trade unions that sort of preempt the formation of independent unions, but don't do a good job of winning workers' trust and channeling them. And then they just have that disjuncture between their founding ideals and current realities, and that disjuncture is all the more salient if they're still ruled by some sort of nominally communist or socialist party. So I think China shares those things with a good chunk of the world's autocracies. And in those autocracies, you see a similar sort of oscillation between reform and repression, and the two often coming right together at the same time.
Yeah, Yeah, thank you. So I think it's a bit depressing to hear that both the responsiveness of the state and repressiveness states, both workers' protest kind of contributes to the state capacity. So with that, what is the more optimistic note that you get from this book?
Well, yeah, it is a little bit depressing. I guess I should say that it's, you know, the repression in and of itself isn't unique to China or even unique to autocracies or post-state socialist autocracies. You've had incredibly repressive moments in my home country's history, in the United States history, when it comes to labor as well. You know, what's sort of unique, I think, to China and countries similar to it is these things coming right together at the same time. In terms of reasons to be optimistic, workers, and this maybe sort of betrays my sort of my normative leanings, workers are still going on strike, and they're going on strike in numbers that dwarf those of lots of other countries. So evidently, from the perspective of workers, the benefits of taking action outweigh the costs. And often they win something from their activism. And as my research shows, although their activism is maybe building the state's repressive capacity, it's also pulling out sort of national level legislation that helps the workers' cause.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for sharing the more optimistic side. So, yeah, I see some questions coming in. So one audience has a question for Reza. Could you elaborate about available statistical sources of economic and social development in Xinjiang, and which sources you use mostly? So that's from Kate Larson, sorry if I pronounced wrong your name, who's the editor of Kinabladent. Sorry.
Great. Well, thank you, Kate, for your question. There's several sources you can use. So obviously CHESS is a great source, the China Household and Ethnicity Survey. So that's one source there. There's in the Xinjiang context, there's statistical yearbooks. Now it's digitized, so you can actually access that through the China Statistical Press, or and you can also get the national level one there. There's a few other sets. I mean, if I think like an economist, you can just find different surveys, and we use sets. So CHIP is the data there, the China Household Income Project. They have a couple of waves. There is a China Health and Nutrition surveys I've used in the past. So basically, and there's of course the census data, the 1% sample that you can utilize as well, and that is a bit tougher to find, but you can find it online these days. So there's many different ways you can approach this, and most of the large data sets do have an ethnic minority variable, but that's what makes CHESS, of course, a bit unique, is that it's purely towards geared towards ethnic minorities, and we did work with NBS, National Bureau of Statistics, and to make sure that we were surveying areas and sampling areas in accordance to their sort of practices. So just the data sets I've used in the past. Yeah, thank you for your question.
Thanks for sharing. So we also have two questions from Heidi herself from University of Oslo, and also the host of the seminar. So one question is for Professor Elfstrom. What has been the role of labor brokers, for example, like labor intermediaries, being in encouraging or preventing labor unrest? Would you like to respond first?
Sure. Just to clarify, are we talking about people, for example, who lead a crew of construction workers to work at a particular construction site?
Yeah, I was thinking both formal, you can choose either formal labor brokers, labor agencies, or the more informal ones who gather a crew and then go to a site, like you mentioned.
Well, I think in general, a responsibility of intermediaries like this is to keep the workers under them in line, to manage their little platoon within a factory or within a construction site, because of course these people play a role in factories as well. But there are a lot of instances of these people mobilizing workers as well. When the boss doesn't pay a group, they are negatively affected, just like their workers are negatively affected, and perhaps their reputation back in their village would be hurt, and therefore their sort of long-term income would be undermined if say, the people under them didn't get paid. So they do sometimes throw their lot with the workers and act as catalysts for activism as well. In factories, this is getting a little bit beyond the kind of labor intermediaries you're talking about, but sometimes low-level managers are important parts of strikes. They can provide a great sort of coordinating function. At the same time, they're easy to be bought off by management.
I guess sometimes the labor brokerage system also relies on ethnic ties, ethnic networks. I remember one of the speaker ever shared her research in this seminar series, Ma Xinlong. Her research is about how people rely on these ethnic ties and ethnic brokerage. How does he organize labor, and also sometimes bringing up unrest. Yeah. And also another question to Professor Reza Hasmath. Among young Uyghurs today, is there a sense that the social contract you mentioned is broken? For example, that higher education, Chinese language skills, other modern skills will not necessarily no longer is felt to guarantee a good life?
So it's not necessarily a social contract per se. What it is a contract of some sort. We've known since the 1950s that education alone is not a passport to labor market opportunities. We've known that for quite some time. Whether or not that gets translated into the everyday, if I speak to my students, I know I'm speaking to a lot of university students here as well, and that's to say you should not be in university, but your education alone is not the passport to a good high wage occupational outcome. I think when we do look at the young Quakers who I interviewed, it was perhaps their only sort of way of upward mobility, at least from an economic standpoint. And they saw this as a passport to actually have a better material life, better than what their parents had. And I think for many of them, in fact, most of them, in some form of there was a psychological contract that was there. Insofar they thought if they work hard, if they get a good education, they do the right things, in schooling, that is, that when they get to the labor market, they're going to get a very good job and a wage that's accordance to the hard work and education that they have. Unfortunately, they don't have, in order to get a good job, and this is true for most jurisdictions, if not all, as I mentioned beforehand, you do need to have the ability to have networks, weak ties. If you want to be very, very acute, you need to be able to fit within the working culture. There's many characteristics. You need to have confidence, even, something I've looked at. You need to have these characteristics that lead you to getting a higher wage position. And what we find is that Uyghurs don't have the co-ethnic sort of labor sort of networks as Han Chinese do. And so if you remember that chart I showed where Hans dominate every single high status, high paying occupational category, that suggests that they also have better networks. And so young Uyghurs don't have access to those networks. So in a way, it is not necessarily a social contract per se that has been broken, but it's a psychological contract that was violated. And perhaps the key is to readjust that psychological contract at a very young age to say, look, your education alone is not going to lead to better occupational outcomes, that you need to do other aspects to get that good job and good wage.
Yeah, sometimes education is even used as an excuse to to cover for the inequalities that they experience. And there's another question from an audience who wants to remain anonymous. It is for Professor Hasmath. Which among the minority groups are doing well socially and economically?
So which groups are doing very well socioeconomically? Yeah. So as I mentioned, the Koreans are doing extremely well, in fact, better than Han Chinese. And they're doing better for two reasons. One, they're able to access South Korean firms who are paying better. And so if you look at the Eastern Seaboard, they're able to access that there. We're also seeing that if you look at Manchus, if you're looking at, I can name, I would say about 30 of the ethnic minority groups have similar experiences as Han Chinese, which suggests to you that a lot of the ethnic categorizations, at least from a sociological and anthropological standpoint, may not hold as much truth anymore. The issue in China is that there's fixed ethnic minority categorizations. And so you're ascribed that ethnicity at birth, irrespective of whether or not you practice that ethnicity. So for many, I would say about 30-something ethnic groups are doing relatively similar to what Han Chinese are doing in their locale. It's really the outsider minorities, the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, who are not doing very well. But the most extreme example are the Koreans, who are doing quite well from an economic standpoint.
Yeah, thank you. So I don't have any questions. If anyone still have any questions, you are very welcome to send it to me. Meanwhile, may I take this privilege to ask more questions if I'm allowed? So it is for Reza again. You asked tentatively, very provocatively in the book, that because many ethnic minorities are signified, like you said, there are not much difference from Han Chinese, but the categories is very fixed. So there are some scholars asking, is it necessary to rethink this categorization or to even abolish? Or how do we capture this phenomenon when some minority is increasingly assimilated into Han?
So having a fixed identification is problematic. It is extremely problematic. It is a reality that ethnic groups are born, ethnic groups survive, ethnic groups die. There's mortality. There's an evolution of ethnic groups. That's anywhere in the world. And so to have a fixed categorization artificially maintains certain ethnic groups that their numbers are dwindling or to the point where it's near extinct. So that's not the only reason. Most ethnic groups do not need preferential treatment. Most ethnic groups do not need the social policy protections that are being provided by the state. The key bit here is a political and governance issue, though. And that's where we continue to have to fix identification. Insofar that there are, since national minorities policy, since the 1949 Constitution, if you look at social policy protections, they do not distinguish between different ethnic groups. They just say ethnic minority and non-ethnic minority, basically, right? So it is, once you open that box, as I mentioned beforehand, once you open that box to have a rethink of ethnic minorities, or affirmative action, or in Western parlance, it is problematic. It is problematic because it means you need to rethink constitutional protections. You need to rethink preferential treatments. And the attendant fear is that you're not going to, it's the situation for Uyghurs or Tibetans are going to be even worse because those protections for the most part may not survive a rethink of the ethnic minority category. What you can do, if I was put my political science hat on, is you can be strategically ignorant. And it's something that a lot of policymakers can do. Insofar, there are certain groups who are not doing very well, and other groups are doing much better. That is, you target social policies, you target social protections, you target basic income sort of models to certain at-risk ethnic minorities, which are these outsider minorities. And so there are ways around this, but it would require strategic ignorance, policy innovation, and experimentation, which necessarily may not be reported back up. And so that's a practical way to approach this.
Yeah, Thank you so much. And we have another question for you, and it's also from Kate Larson. She asked a question before, and it's the editor of Norwegian for China magazine. And do you make use of the different statistical yearbooks for local areas and cities in Xinjiang, and the local gazetteers for almost all counties, which are available but seldom used by scholars?
So actually I do. So in some of the papers that I listed in the slide, I was using the statistical yearbooks as an example. I mean, it was one way to add weight to the arguments. And so there is data checks we can do to make sure they're reliable. So if it corresponds to the chess data, which we have sampling in Xinjiang. So that's often, if I was to forecast, the questions might happen thereafter is how reliable is the statistical yearbooks? I would say from 2010 onwards, they do use international standards, but also we can use sort of tests to make sure they're robust, comparing it at least to the chess data, because we are using NBS cluster sampling sizes that NBS uses for the statistical yearbooks as well as the chess data.
Yeah, thank you. So again, please do keep sending me your questions. And meanwhile, I have a question coming. It's from Sid. Her question is for Professor Elfstrom. Her question is, you mentioned how soft and hard policy towards labor conflict changes back and forth. Are these changes mostly related to the leadership at the time, or are other factors more important?
That's a great question. In the book, I emphasize swings that come with the leadership at the top, but there are obviously other factors at play, and the particular individuals who happen to be in particular positions, furthermore, might be an expression of some sort of changed elite consensus themselves. And just to give an example of some evidence of that kind of dynamic being at play, I have a paper with Yao Li where we look at the likelihood of a mass incident of any sort, not just labor unrest, being met with overt repression, arrests or violence by police, given different local levels of public security spending. And we find that under Xi Jinping, places that spend more on the police are more likely to repress protests, whereas under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, the opposite is the case. More spending means less overt repression. But critically, we also find that the inflection point came before Xi Jinping came into office. So, on average, these administrations handle unrest differently, but in this instance, it seems like Xi Jinping is sort of a product of a changed sort of broader government approach to unrest rather than the other way around. So the government was starting to alter its the way it handled activism, the way it used its security forces, and then Xi came as a part of that alteration. Yeah, I guess to the other part of your question, then why did that happen? Part of that I think is just rising unrest and sort of spikes in unrest.
Yeah, another question from the audience for you. So what do you see as significant differences in the characteristics of worker unrest in democratic countries and those in a more socialist ones, such as China?
Again, I sort of treat China as a post-socialist country, along with Russia or maybe Egypt or other places, but maybe that if we take the distinction just between a democratic and an autocratic country, I think the big difference beyond sort of obvious restrictions on freedom of assembly in non-democracies is the space allowed for trade unions and labor unrest, say here in Canada, often happens through trade unions, and they're the ones holding a strike vote, and they're the ones bargaining in advance of a strike and after a strike, whereas in China, the unions sort of secondary to it all. They come in after the conflict is already well underway and try to restore order. I think that's, the big difference. So in China, the activism has to use other, what social movement scholars call mobilizing structures. So people from the same hometown, people sharing a dormitory, sort of well-placed people, like again, low-level managers, that kind of thing to organize. And because, maybe one final little point there, because they don't have a union through which to pressure their employers, it's really hard to resolve industrial conflicts in China. You don't have an obvious person on the other side of the bargaining table to hash out a compromise. So the companies and the government sort of throw different things at the situation. Oh, maybe we could raise wages this much. Maybe we could, pay a little more in our severance package and see if it works. But there's not like a clear bargaining process.
Thank you. So another audience question for Reza is, are you aware of the Newsline Institute bracket for strategy and policy and report, the Newsline Institute report alleging or claiming genocide in Xinjiang?
So I am not quite sure about the Institute, but I do know there are reports. There's a report out of Australia. And I do know the authors there who did that. I also know there's been reports out of Germany. I know some of the authors who did that as well. I'll be very careful to throw around the word genocide. There's a very strong legal definition for that in international law. Whether or not it meets that threshold, I would say it's suspect. But I would say at the most, I guess the most basic level, if you look at the conditions of work camps or prisons all across China, it's deplorable. And so if it's the first time you've ever seen images of that, it can be deplorable. So that's one. The other thing I would suggest as well is we do need to question the sort of governance among the different localities in Xinjiang and how the local officials are determining who is at risk. And those at-risk individuals, why are they being sent to detention areas? But these kinds of re-education sort of schools or re-education kind of camps, as being called, it's not new. It's been around forever. It's been around since I started doing field work. At least I can speak from my own experiences. What's different now is the scale, and it's also there's greater attention on that. What I would suggest, the final point I would suggest is that there aren't many people who actually go to Xinjiang who are Westerners. And so the reports that you do get, if you're looking at the Australian Institute or the one from Germany, are secondary sources. Some are using satellite imagery, some are using third-party sort of materials. And so this is not to suggest that there isn't something awry there or something that deserves international attention. But it's to suggest that we need to have a better threshold, especially if we're throwing around terms such as genocide, which has a very strict legal definition. And what it does serve to do is it does bring attention to the issue, which is great from one standpoint. But on the other hand, it may detract from the sort of tangible outcomes or tangible solutions we can have towards Xinjiang. And I think the international, and when I do speak to diplomats and when I do speak to government officials about this, I do mention to them, look, we have similar experiences in the Canadian context, for example, where we didn't treat our native groups very well. And so it's not a matter of preaching to China, but it's saying, look, we've had these experiences. This is what we learned from them. This is how we can share with you. In the Xinjiang case, it is a securitization sort of aspect that a lot of policy officials in China see it as. And so you need to disaggregate that, understand their internal thinking, and to address it from not only their internal thinking, but our own experiences as well. So that's a sort of broader response to that question.
It's a very complicated question. Thank you for your response. So any other last minute questions? We only have a few minutes left. So perhaps I could introduce the next event first. So this is a seminar series. The next one will be on 3rd of November. It's the same time. You are very welcome to register. And it is called China Has Arrived as a Geopolitical Superpower. And it will include speakers, including Professor Xiang Reslin and Dr. Elizabeth's Economy, and the event will be chaired by Amy Qing, who is an international correspondent for the New York Times. So please do register and please do come to our seminar series later. And I don't see any new questions coming in, so perhaps I'll just take the time to thank our two wonderful speakers for the fascinating presentation and for a very engaging discussion with our audiences. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
So see you at the next seminar. See you.